It was the early hours of December 11th, 1978. Winter's grip on New York was merciless. The wind sliced through thick coats, biting at the faces of men trudging home from overnight shifts. Their footsteps crunched in rhythm against the snow-packed sidewalks. Street lamps stood like watchmen in the fog, their halos of light blurred and ghostly. On the edge of Queens, Kennedy Airport, JFK, loomed as an iron fortress in the night. Warehouses stretched in long shadows, their steel doors locked, their contents priceless. Inside, guards slouched in plastic chairs, sipping stale coffee, their eyes heavy with fatigue. It was a night like any other, quiet, uneventful, forgettable, or so it seemed, because in a few hours, this very place would become the stage for one of the most daring robberies in American history. By dawn, the world would wake to chaos. By morning, millions would be gone. $5 million in cash, nearly $1 million in jewels, vanished overnight. But this story isn't just about money. It's about men, about betrayal, ambition, and greed that spiraled out of control. It's about friendships shattered, lives lost, and questions that have haunted New York for decades. Why did this heist leave so many dead in its wake? Why did the fortune, millions in untraceable cash, never resurface? And who, if anyone, truly walked away rich? This is the Lufthansa Heist. Brooklyn, months before the robbery. In a cramped back room of a neighborhood bar, cigarette smoke curled toward a dim light bulb, filling the space with a haze thick enough to choke on. The table beneath it was scratched and stained, worn by years of whispered secrets and spilled drinks. Around it sat men who lived on the edge. Hustlers, thieves, survivors of a world where trust was fragile and betrayal could be fatal. Their voices dropped low, words barely audible, as they pieced together the blueprint of a crime that could make them legends, or bury them. Among them was Henry Hill, a hustler, part-time gangster, and full-time survivor. Henry wasn't the muscle. He wasn't the brains. He was the connector, the man who always seemed to know someone who knew someone. Years later, he recalled those nights. It was supposed to be the perfect score. Nobody gets hurt. Everybody walks away rich. And then there was Jimmy Burke, known in the streets as Jimmy the Gent. Outwardly, he was charming, generous even. He bought rounds at the bar, slipped bills to neighborhood kids, and smiled like a man you could trust. But beneath that polished surface was something darker. Jimmy built loyalty through fear. He didn't forgive mistakes. And in his world, silence wasn't just golden, it was survival. The opportunity had come through a tip. Lufthansa Airlines, operating out of JFK, was receiving regular shipments of US currency flown in from West Germany. The money, millions in unmarked bills, was stored overnight in the airline's cargo terminal before being transferred to international banks. It was the perfect target. Vast sums of cash, lightly guarded, sitting in plain sight. Jimmy knew it was risky, but risk was the currency of the underworld. The plan was simple. Slip in, secure the guards, grab the money, and vanish before the city woke. But in organized crime, simplicity is a lie. Nothing stays simple. Because when millions dangle in front of desperate men, greed begins to whisper. And when greed whispers, loyalty fades. The stage was set. But no one, not Jimmy, not Henry, not even the men who would carry out the heist, could predict how dark this plan would turn. December 11th, 1978. 3 a.m. A black van rumbled quietly down the icy streets of Queens. Inside, 6 men sat in silence, their breath fogged in the cold air. Guns rested in gloved hands. Every bump of the road felt louder than it should have, every passing car a threat. As they approached JFK's cargo terminal, the night seemed unnaturally still. Just a skeleton crew was on duty, a handful of guards, a routine shift. The van came to a stop. For a moment, no one moved. Then the doors swung open, and the men stepped out into the freezing air. They moved quickly, efficiently. They stormed the building, their voices sharp, commanding. "This is a stick-up. Nobody moves." Panic rippled through the warehouse. Guards froze, hands trembling as they were tied up and shoved to the floor. One was forced at gunpoint to lead them to the vault. And when the heavy steel door swung open, the sight took their breath away. Stacks upon stacks of bundled cash. Money piled high, packed tighter than bricks. $5 million in untraceable bills. And nearby, nearly $1 million worth of jewels, sparkling in the dim light. The men worked frantically, shoving bills into duffel bags, their hands shaking with adrenaline. One leaned toward another and whispered, almost in disbelief, "We're set for life." Minutes passed like seconds. By 4:30 a.m., the van was gone, swallowed by the darkness of Queens, carrying with it a fortune so vast that it became the largest cash robbery in American history. And when morning came, Lufthansa workers stumbled upon a scene of chaos. Guards bound, vaults empty, millions gone. But as investigators soon learned, the heist itself wasn't the real story. The real story was what came after, because millions breed greed, and greed breeds blood. The headlines hit like a thunderclap. Record airport heist. Millions gone. Reporters swarmed JFK, cameras flashing, while FBI agents rushed to the scene. The entire city buzzed with questions. Who pulled it off? Where was the money? And how long until the law caught up with them? But inside Jimmy Burke's crew, the real problem wasn't the FBI. It was discipline. Jimmy had made it clear. No sudden moves, no lavish spending, no drawing attention. They had to stay invisible. But temptation has a way of speaking louder than caution. One man pulled up in a brand new pink Cadillac. Another paraded mink coats through the neighborhood like trophies. Jewelry sparkled on hands that just weeks before had been empty. Jimmy saw it all. And Jimmy never forgot. And in Jimmy's world, mistakes had only one price. Bodies began to fall. One man was found strangled in his car, the interior reeking of gasoline. Another was discovered slumped in an alleyway, his lifeless body riddled with bullets. Some disappeared completely, their fates whispered about but never proven. By spring, the heist that promised freedom had become a death sentence. The perfect score was now a graveyard of secrets. And still, the money had vanished without a trace. Not a dollar recovered. Not a single jewel. So where did it go? Who held it? The silence was deafening. For the FBI, the Lufthansa heist was a case that seemed impossible to crack. Millions were gone. Witnesses were terrified. Mobsters sat stone-faced. Agents planted wiretaps. They tailed Jimmy Burke. They leaned on Henry Hill. They dug into every lead, every rumor, every whisper. But they hit the same wall again and again, silence. Detectives would later admit, everybody knew who did it, but knowing and proving are two very different things. Even the guards who lived through that terrifying night couldn't help. The robbers had worn masks, distorted their voices, moved too fast for anyone to see clearly. And so the case dragged on. Files stacked higher. Leads dried up. It was as though the $5 million had been swallowed whole by the city itself. But the truth was simpler and darker. The mob had closed ranks. And in a world where silence meant survival, no one was willing to talk. Time passed. Years slipped away. And then cracks began to form. Henry Hill, once a trusted part of Jimmy's circle, was spiraling. Drugs consumed him. Paranoia followed him everywhere. And as the bodies around him piled up, Henry became convinced. His turn was coming. So he did the unthinkable. Henry flipped. He walked into the arms of the FBI and traded his silence for survival. He poured out stories of Jimmy's plan, the van that carried the fortune, the killings that followed. For the first time, investigators had a map of what really happened that December night. But even Henry, who had been there in the shadows, couldn't say what mattered most, where the money went. Jimmy Burke would eventually face trial, but not for Lufthansa. For that crime, he slipped through the cracks of the law. The greatest heist in American history remained unsolved. And still, the question burned. Was the true mastermind ever caught? Or did someone die with millions hidden away? The Lufthansa heist became more than a crime. It became legend. Books dissected it. Films dramatized it. Scorsese's Goodfellas etched it into pop culture forever. But for those who lived it, there was no legend, only a curse. The robbery that was supposed to set men free destroyed them instead. Families mourned. Friends vanished. Survivors lived in fear, looking over their shoulders for years. And the money, it was gone. Ghost money, whispered about in backrooms, speculated about in headlines, but never found. Even decades later, the questions persist. Did Jimmy bury it? Was it laundered into businesses, hidden in plain sight? Or does it lie still, waiting to be unearthed by hands that know nothing of the blood spilled to earn it? The fortune haunts New York to this day, not because of what was stolen, but because of what was lost. December 11th, 1978. A night when New York froze. A night when $5 million slipped into the shadows. Some call it the greatest robbery of all time. Others call it a massacre disguised as a payday. But maybe the story was never about the money. Maybe it was about greed, about silence, about how ambition, once it runs too hot, consumes everything in its path. And maybe, just maybe, the fortune is still out there, waiting. But if it is, who dares to claim it? This was the Lufthansa Heist, and this is Captain Justice True Stories. If you're still here, subscribe, because stories like this deserve more eyes and more voices.